And now for more on the violence in Syria, we're joined by Marc Ginsberg, former U.S. ambassador to Morocco. He's in our Washington bureau. Ambassador Ginsberg recently wrote an article about the humanitarian crisis in Syria. That was in the Huffington Post. Good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Before we get to that article in the Huffington Post, I want to talk first about the news this morning, that top army general being killed. Is this an escalation?
There's no doubt that there's a series of attacks that have been launched by the Free Syrian Army against the elements of the regime that are basically involved in coordinating the fighting. This is probably one of the highest level Syrian officials that have actually been the target probably of an assassination by defectors who essentially are engaged in reprisal attacks against the military for the slaughter that's taking place across the country.
As these rebels get closer and closer to these main cities, right?
Exactly. In fact, until the Russian veto in the UN, which I know we'll talk about, the Free Syrian Army actually had control over some of the outskirts of Damascus, which is an indication of how far this rebellion has advanced to the major cities of Syria, beyond those cities that have essentially been rebelling since the beginning of this rebellion in March of last year.
Now, Ambassador, in that article you wrote in the Huffington Post, you mentioned a double standard. Why were we so eager to get involved in Libya, but not so much with Syria?
Well, the administration makes this argument that Syria is a far more complicated situation that could spill over across the region, whereas with Libya, there was an imminent threat of a humanitarian catastrophe. Frankly, I argued in this article that that's a double standard, that the slaughter that's taking place in Syria, evidenced by the interviews by the U.S. ambassador, Robert Ford, just in the last few days, is an indication that the administration needs to stop leading from behind here and needs to basically coordinate a major effort to try to stop the arms transfers that Russia's engaged in under the very guise of its own veto. If there's any country that's actually engaged in militarizing the situation, it's Russia under the cover of its own veto.
Ambassador, just briefly, what can be done after last weekend Russia and China both blocked this Security Council resolution? Without that resolution, what options are there?
There's many things that the United States can do. First, it can coordinate with the United States and the European Union to bring an indictment in the International Criminal Court against the Assad regime. Two, it can launch a humanitarian corridor through Turkey to provide support to the refugees and others who are fleeing the fighting. Third, it can basically press the United Nations to pass a resolution to oppose these armed transfers and dare the Russians to veto that resolution. Fourth, we engage in all sorts of covert activity in Libya under the guise of American need to provide humanitarian support.
Right.
We're not doing enough. It's clear that this administration is sitting back on its laurels in Libya, and as a result, the Syrian people are paying a price for the administration's reluctance under the argument it doesn't want to militarize the situation any further. Right. It really needs to get more involved.
Ambassador Marc Ginsberg, thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.